Typically, uncommons in Magic aren't very expensive. After all, uncommon is the second lowest rarity in the game, and booster packs tend to have multiples of them. However, there are some uncommons out there that are in such high demand and or in such low supply that they still have a pretty high price tag despite the fact that they don't have a higher rarity. In this video, we're going to take a look at Magic's 10 most expensive blue uncommons, and I'll also explain what makes them so expensive. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get to the list, let me discuss the methodology for this video. The prices in it are Card Kingdom near mint prices, and they're the prices for the cheapest printing of a card. In other words, something like Counterspell isn't going to appear here. Sure, the original one from Alpha is worth hundreds of dollars, but you can also get your hands on a copy of Counterspell for less than $1. In other words, the prices in this video are the least amount you can pay for a near mint copy of the card, regardless of the printing. Alright, with that out of the way, let's look at the 10 most expensive blue uncommons, starting with Hedron Crab, which costs about $10. For 1 blue mana, it's a 0/2, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, target player mills 3 cards. Hedron Crab is one of the most efficient ways to repeatedly mill either yourself or your opponent, and for that reason in 60-card formats it's been used in graveyard decks, as well as mill decks. Only ever paying 1 mana for this thing and milling 3 or more cards almost every turn adds up quickly, and the crab gets especially potent when you put extra lands into play using fetch lands or other means. Over the last few years, it's become even more viable as more powerful mill cards have been printed, like the similar Ruin Crab, Jace the Perfected Mind, and Tasha's Hideous Laughter. This has spawned powerful mill decks in Modern. It's also seeing play in Legacy, though largely in self-mill decks looking to get Hogak into play early. In addition to being an important card in Modern and Legacy, Hedron Crab shows up in a fair share of Commander decks too. Just like in 60-card formats, the crab is worth considering if you're interested in loading up your own graveyard or trying to mill out your opponent. Hedron Crab's original printing in 2009 is where most copies of the crab come from, since the only time it's been reprinted was on the list, a curated subset of cards that used to appear in booster packs, so it was far from a normal print run. So, Hedron Crab is a pretty scarce uncommon, and one that's in fairly high demand for 60-card and 100-card enthusiasts, and that's a good recipe for ending up with a $10 price tag. At number 9, it's Sink into Stupor, which costs about $12. By far the newest card on the list, it was printed just last year in Modern Horizons 3. It's a modal double-face card, which means that you can choose to play either side of it when it's in your hand. One side is the spell, Sink into Stupor. For 1 generic and 2 blue, it's an instant, and it returns a spell or non-land permanent opponent controls to its owner's hand. That's a pretty nice interactive spell, since it can both deal with things on the board and on the stack, and it can even hit everything but lands. Still, if this card was just Sink into Stupor, it probably wouldn't cost $12. But the other side is a land called Soporific Springs. It enters tapped unless you pay 3 life, and it can tap for blue mana. In other words, this is a land when that's what you need, and a spell when that's what you need. That's inherently powerful, as it gives your deck a way to minimize both getting mana screwed and getting flooded, and while the spell side is a bit underpowered for the cost and the land side is basically a bad island, having one card that can do both things is a very big deal. Because it's from Modern Horizons 3, the only 60-card format Sink into Stupor is legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. It's quickly found homes in all 3 formats, even becoming a staple in blue decks in Modern. Some decks look to really abuse the way that modal double-face cards work too. For example, they're the only type of lands that Goblin Charbelcher decks run. These cards are not seen as lands by Goblin Charbelcher, so when you activate it once, it will always do lethal because it reveals your entire landless deck. Similarly, in Legacy and Vintage, it's played alongside Undercity Informer and Balustrade Spy. Both of them have an effect that will mill your whole library when you don't have any lands in your deck, and then these decks can win the game with a reanimated Thassa's Oracle. Unsurprisingly, it's also heavily played in Commander, where having a spell that is also a land is powerful for all the same reasons. So Sink into Stupor is in really high demand, since it's being played in all the 60-card formats it's legal in, and it's a sought-after uncommon for Commander, and so far, it just has the one printing in Modern Horizons 3. At number 8, it's Chain of Vapor, which costs about $12. For 1 blue mana, it's an instant that bounces a non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and then that permanent's controller can sacrifice a land of their choice, and if they do, they can copy Chain of Vapor and choose new targets for the copy. Obviously, as this card's name implies, if both players, or one player, keeps on going, there can be a pretty long chain of this spell being cast. At only a single mana, this is the most efficient way to bounce a non-land permanent at instant speed in all of Magic. And while giving your opponent a crack at casting it is certainly a downside, the decks that run the chain tend to be control or combo decks that don't intend on having non-creatures in play to be bounced when they cast it. And they also tend to run plenty of counter magic, in which case the copy can be countered, and that counter spell kind of turns into a land destruction spell. Chain of Vapor is not only one of the best ways to bounce your opponent's stuff, it's also one of the best ways to bounce your own stuff for value. If you target your own permanent with it, you can choose to sacrifice lands to keep making copies when that's useful for you, like if you're trying to rebuy interest triggers or recast things to up your storm count. This is one of the ways Chain of Vapor is often used in Legacy and Vintage today, and it sees a ton of play in both formats outside of Storm decks too. So it sees significant play in both of the Eternal formats, and it's also a popular commander card, appearing in more than 100,000 decks on EDHREC. So far, it's never been reprinted in a set with a large print run. Since appearing in Onslaught, it has only been available in Commander 2016 and Mystery Booster 2. So even though it's uncommon, it's hard to get your hands on between all the Eternal and Commander players who want it. At number 7, it's Brain Freeze, which costs about $13. For 1 generic and a blue, it's an instant that mills the top 3 cards of target player's library, and it has Storm, which means when you cast it, you copy it for each spell cast before it this turn, and you can choose new targets for the copy. Like Hedron Crab, Brain Freeze is one of the best ways to mill either yourself or your opponent in the entire game, and it's been used in both ways. It's been played in Storm decks in Extended Legacy and Vintage that look to cast a bunch of rituals and draw a bunch of cards, before firing off Brain Freeze with a super high Storm count and milling the opponent's entire library. These days, it's also being played in Underworld Breach decks in both Legacy and Vintage. These decks feed off of the graveyard because the Breach lets you cast cards from it. And, unlike most effects that let you cast cards from the graveyard, the spells you cast don't get exiled. However, Underworld Breach does require fuel in the form of cards in the graveyard. So the deck uses fast mana like Lion's Eye Diamond alongside the Breach to get the Storm count really high, while targeting itself with Brain Freeze to keep the graveyard stocked so spells can keep being cast. Then, once the Storm count is high enough, the Freeze can target the opponent and mill their entire library. Like Chain of Vapor, it's never been reprinted in a set with a normal print run, only showing up on the list and in Mystery Booster 2. It's heavily played in the Eternal formats and also quite popular in Commander, so it's no surprise that this card costs $13. At number 6, it's Mystical Tutor, which costs about $14. It's 1 blue mana for an instant that tutors up an instant or sorcery and puts it on top of your library. Tutoring something to the top of your library is weaker than putting it into your hand. In fact, it's card disadvantage. But this is a very cheap spell, and it can search up cards with 2 different types at instant speed, so it's well worth the downside in many decks. For example, the Tutor has seen a lot of play in 60-card formats over the years, helping decks like High Tide and Ad Nauseam Combo find their crucial cards. These days, Mystical Tutor is banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage, limiting just how much demand for it there can be in 60-card formats. But many blue decks in the format run the one copy they are allowed, especially in decks that are particularly reliant on powerful instants or sorceries, like Doomsday decks. But it's also played in more than just that kind of deck, since having a tutor that can grab Time Walk or Ancestral Recall is a pretty big deal. Like most powerful tutors, Mystical Tutor is heavily played in Commander. This is because the tutor becomes even better in a singleton format, since it's effectively an extra copy of whatever the best or most useful instant or sorcery in your deck is. It's in almost 400,000 decks in EDHREC, which amounts to 15% of all the decks that it could be played in, and I think it's safe to say that number would be even higher if it didn't cost $14. While the Tutor has been reprinted several times, it's never been featured at the Uncommon Rarity since its 6th edition reprint, instead being printed at rare and limited release sets like Eternal Masters and Dominaria Remastered, so it's still a card that's in limited supply given how high the demand is. Before we get to the top half of the list, I want to take a moment and ask you to subscribe if you are enjoying my content and haven't already subscribed. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers this year, and I'd really appreciate it if you help me get there. At number 5, it's Woo Spy, which costs about $18. For one generic and a blue, it's a 1/1, and when it enters, you look at the top 2 cards of target player's library and put one of them into the graveyard. That's not the most impressive creature, although the enters ability isn't a terrible way to get some card selection and load your graveyard or have some control over the next card your opponent draws, but it's also super understated and there are far better ways to do both of those things. Because of that, no one plays it in EDH, and it's never been played in 60-card formats either. So what's the deal? Why is this uncommon $18 if no one wants it? Well, it's because it's incredibly rare despite its rarity. It's from Portal 3 Kingdoms, a set released as a standalone game that was intended for Asian markets as an on-ramp for Magic. You can see that this was a beginner product by looking at Woo Spy, since it has a sword next to its power and a shield next to its toughness, just so new players won't mix up power and toughness. Cards from this set always show up on most expensive lists because the print run for these cards, especially in English, was incredibly limited. This results in cards from the set having very high prices, even when no one plays them. So this is a case where collectors who just want to own all of the Magic cards from a specific set are the primary reason that this card is so expensive. At number 4, it's Merchant Ship, which costs about $38. For one blue mana, it's a 0/2 that can't attack unless defending player controls an island, and whenever it attacks and isn't blocked, you gain 2 life, and when you control no islands, you sacrifice Merchant Ship. Yeah, Merchant Ship makes Woo Spy look like Spirit Monger. This is a card that has made some appearances on my worst cards lists, and for good reason. It's a 1 mana 0/2 with a whole bunch of downside and very little upside. It won't be able to attack very often, and even when it does, it rarely does anything worthwhile. But hey, the flavor of this card is kind of cool. Ships do need water and islands after all, and when this manages to make it to the port to trade, you gain 2 life, I guess? But yeah, as with Woo Spy, this is a case where the price tag is entirely a result of how rare the card is. Merchant Ship is from Arabian Nights, a set released in 1993 as Magic's first expansion, and Merchant Ship is on the reserved list. This is a list of older Magic cards that Wizards of the Coast has promised never to reprint. This means that all the Merchant Ships that there will ever be already exist, and they were printed in a set that came out 32 years ago. So yeah, the supply of Merchant Ships is incredibly limited, so even though it's terrible, it costs $38. At number 3, I've included 2 cards because they're both uncommons from Legends. Mana Drain, which costs about $45, and Sea King's Blessing, which costs about $22. Mana Drain is a legitimate number 3 card on the list, while Sea King's Blessing would have been at number 5. Mana Drain is 2 blue mana and it counters a spell, and then on your next main phase, you add an amount of colorless mana equal to that spell's mana value. While that last part is entirely upside today, back when it was originally printed, it wasn't pure upside because of mana burn, which meant you took damage when you ended a phase with unused mana. That said, even when that part hurt you sometimes, the card was still completely insane. Most of the time, you could make use of the mana without too much trouble. I mean, the card even got banned in Legacy in 2004 before mana burn was eliminated from the rules, and it's just even better today. Countering a spell and then ramping into something awesome on your next turn is amazing. Because it's been banned in Legacy since the day it became an officially supported format, the only 60-card format it's been able to gain points in for most of its history is Vintage, but it's powerful enough to even see play there. But that format does have lots of powerful counterspells, and the ones that don't cost any mana at all tend to see more play than Mana Drain does. So there's some demand for it in Vintage, but not an incredible amount either. The same can't be said in Commander, where it's the 11th most heavily played mono blue card. It appears in almost 400,000 decks in EDHREC, amounting to 15% of all blue decks. Countering a spell and ramping into something insane happens more often in Commander than it does in Vintage. As with Mystical Tutor, it's been reprinted pretty regularly, but always at much higher rarities than the original Uncommon, really limiting the supply of mana drains out there. Sea King's Blessing, meanwhile, is 1 blue mana for an instant that makes 1 or more target creatures blue until end of turn. This is a famously weak type of effect, but at least it is interesting that Sea King's Blessing gives you a 1 mana way to target every single one of your creatures, and that does have some applications. That said, the reason for its high price tag is much more similar to Merchant Ship and Woo Spy than to Mana Drain. This is because it's never been played in 60 card formats, nor is it heavily played in Commander. It's $22 largely because it's only been printed a single time in Legends. Unlike Merchant Ship, it's not on the reserve list, so the potential for a reprint is out there, and if that ever happens, the price is likely to go down significantly. At number 2, it's Force of Will, which costs about $70. For 3 generic and 2 blue, Force of Will counters a spell, but it also has an alternate cost. You can pay 1 life and exile a blue card from your hand to cast it for free instead. And the setup cost of casting it for free is incredibly easy to set up, as if you're a control deck, you're likely to have extra cards in hand and many of them will be blue. Importantly, it's even useful on turn 1 when you have 0 permanents in play, when it's still capable of countering just about anything. All of that means that Force of Will is the best counterspell ever printed. Sure, it doesn't have the same crazy ceiling as a card like Mana Drain does, but this is so easy to cast for free that it's definitely better. It has, of course, been heavily played in any format it's ever been legal in, and it's also always been a staple in both Legacy and Vintage. It sees play in more than half of all Legacy decks, and the number is even higher in Vintage. It's just as heavily played as the Power 9R in the latter format, and it's format defining for both. This means Force of Will's demand in 60 card formats is as high as it could possibly be, and like Mana Drain and Mystical Tutor, it's also super heavily played in Commander, although it's less heavily played than those two, probably partly because of its $70 price tag. It's also been reprinted the same way that Mana Drain and Mystical Tutor have been. That is, it's appeared in lots of limited print run sets and only at higher rarities, so it's still pretty hard to find Force of Will. However, even with all of that high demand and low supply, Force of Will is not the most expensive blue uncommon ever printed. Instead, we'll see that in the number 1 slot on the list, where we have 2 different uncommons from Antiquities, Transmute Artifact, which costs a whopping $400, and Power Artifact, which costs a slightly less ridiculous $200. If I gave them each their own spot, they would have been number 1 and 2 on the list. As you can probably guess from the astronomical price tag, both of these are on the reserved list, and unlike the other reserved list cards we've seen on the list, they actually see some play. Transmute Artifact is 2 blue mana for a sorcery. When you cast it, you sacrifice an artifact and search your library for an artifact card. If that card's mana value is less than or equal to the sacrificed artifact's mana value, you put it onto the battlefield. And if it's greater, you can pay X mana, where X is the difference. If you do, you put it onto the battlefield, and if you don't, you put it into your graveyard. So it's complicated, but it's kind of doing an impression of Tinker, or maybe Tinker is doing an impression of it because it's a more recent card. But my point here is that it's an artifact tutor that requires you to sacrifice an artifact. I make the Tinker comparison because overall that's a stronger card, and it's an absolutely insane one, and this card is a little bit more balanced, plus Tinker is banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage, while you're allowed to play as many Transmute artifacts as you want in both formats, and indeed it does see play in artifact decks in both Legacy and Vintage. It's also heavily played in Commander, especially for a $400 card. It would be a straight up staple in artifact decks in the format if it were more affordable, since it's so good at tutoring them up. Power Artifact isn't quite as insane as illustrated by its much lower price tag. For 2 blue mana, it's an enchantment aura with Enchant Artifact, and it makes it so the enchanted artifact's ability costs 2 generic less to activate, but you can't reduce the cost to below 1 mana. While Transmute Artifact is good with just about any artifacts, Power Artifact needs artifacts with activated abilities in particular. It's only seen very sparse play in 60 card formats, and it's not heavily played in Commander either, but there are some nasty combos that it enables. For example, if you combine it with Grim or Basalt Monolith, you can produce infinite colorless mana, since they both tap for mana and require mana to untap, but you reduce the cost of the untap ability, so you net mana every time you untap them and tap them again. So if you're playing an artifact deck with lots of activated abilities, as well as the monoliths, it's probably a good idea to think about using Power Artifact. You know, if you happen to have $200 lying around. So those are the most expensive blue commons in Magic the Gathering. If you want to own any of these super powerful blue cards, or also Woo Spy and Merchant Ship, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the most expensive cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.